Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, coming to you from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion on converging allied perspectives and AI adoption, which CEPA is honored to hold in partnership with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, or NSCAI. NSCI, as most of you probably know, is an independent US commission which was established in 2018 to consider the methods and means necessary to advance the development of AI, machine learning, and associated technologies. This past March, NSCI released its final report, which includes recommendations on how the US can quickly develop its AI capabilities for defense and national security purposes, seeking to be AI ready by 2025. Meanwhile, the new US administration under President Joe Biden has focused on ramping up efforts to compete with China in matters of technology and innovation. Just last week, President Biden, in his address to the US Congress, stressed that the US must move more quickly or risk falling behind on these key technologies. All at the same time, NATO is also working to develop a strategy for the security and defense applications of artificial intelligence before allied leaders join together for the NATO summit in June. This is a critical first step to ensure that NATO can strengthen its strategic technological edge by building on the national efforts already underway. There are certainly many challenges ahead, but fortunately we have a fantastic and incredibly impressive lineup today to help us dive into these issues. To frame the discussion, we will kick off with a keynote conversation featuring Gilman Louie, an NSCAI commissioner, who will unpack some of the major challenges from the US perspective. David Van Weel, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, will talk about how NATO plans to approach these issues in developing its own strategy ahead of the June summit. And Vivienne Moxie, a journalist and contributor for Defense News, will moderate that discussion. Quickly following the keynote, we're going to move into a panel discussion that will focus on lessons learned from national contexts on how to approach AI and pave the way for military adoption. Needless to say, we have a fascinating program today that I am very much looking forward to, and I'm grateful to have our very own Lauren Speranza, Director of CEPA's Transatlantic Defense and Security Program, who together with her entire team has really been the force behind putting this important conversation together today. So with that, a warm welcome to our audience once again, and let us now move to the next part of the program with the keynote conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vivienne Moxie, and I'm a reporter covering European defense technology for Defense News. And I'm so happy to be here today as part of this great event put on by the Center for European Policy Analysis and the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. We're going to talk today about a topic that I believe is very critical, it's very timely, and I think we'll have a lively discussion on it, and that is transatlantic cooperation around artificial intelligence, specifically timely ahead of the June summit of allied NATO leaders in Brussels, coming up in just a couple months now. The transatlantic defense community has, of course, been discussing the question of where artificial intelligence fits in the national security sphere for quite a while now. It's not a new topic, but I think it's clear that we are now at an inflection point where governments on both sides of the Atlantic are looking to reveal policy directives that will better inform how they plan to actually use artificial intelligence to both defend against adversary attacks and also employ our own AI-enabled systems and perhaps weapons. And this is an especially timely time to converge and discuss how these ideas will converge across all allies on both sides of the Atlantic. I think a case in point is President Joe Biden in his recent and first address to Congress specifically called out artificial intelligence investment and also warned about the need for the United States and its allies to stay relevant and competitive against an ever more ambitious China. Congress earlier this year supported the creation of a national artificial intelligence strategy, and lawmakers have also introduced bills worth hundreds of billions of dollars that would support research and development tech to stay ahead of China, which would include artificial intelligence. So again, I feel it's a very timely point to be discussing these issues and seeing what nations will actually be doing going forward. On the NATO side, there's been also a lot of progress over the past year as the alliance builds a path forward on how to tackle emerging and disruptive technologies. Artificial intelligence in particular has been highlighted as a critical and immediate need to tackle. And we expect an AI-specific strategy to be released later this summer that will help shed light on where NATO really sees its role in this rapidly developing domain. And of course, there are many organizations that are looking to inform this debate and inform policymakers, not in the least NSCAI, CEPA. I know the Center for New American Security has also written a recent report. So there's lots of people ready to help inform this report. So I'm very happy to be here today with two very distinguished guests and great experts on this subject. We have David Van Weel, the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. So he is in charge of developing a coordinated response by NATO to all new and emerging challenges. So this is definitely in his wheelhouse. He previously had a long and distinguished career at the Netherlands Ministry of Defense. And before joining NATO, he was the foreign policy and defense advisor to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And then we also have with us today NSCAI Commissioner Gilman Louis, who is the co-founder and partner of Alsop Louis Partners, which is an early stage technology venture capital firm focused on disruptive and innovative technologies based in San Francisco, where I'm calling in from this morning. Commissioner Louis is also the first CEO of In-Q-Tel, with long experience in connecting the US intel community with venture-backed companies. So a lot of experience in this particular discussion that we want to talk about. And he also has a very long career in the private tech sector and as an advisor to the intel community. So I want to thank you both, ASG Van Weel and Commissioner Louis, for being with us today. And I have one question that I hope will start off the discussion for both of you. I hope that it will help you will enable you to sort of give your thoughts on this topic. And it comes from the NSCAI's final report that one of the key messages there was, if you lose the artificial intelligence competition, you lose everywhere else. So I'd love for you both to discuss why it's so critical for the transatlantic community to move forward in not just talk the talk, but walk the walk on artificial intelligence in today's environment. And then what are the risks of NATO allies, its partners, falling behind in this technology sphere right now? So ASG Van Weel, I'll start with you and then go to Commissioner Louis.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm not the biggest expert on artificial intelligence as Commissioner Louis is, but maybe that's part of the whole issue that we're trying to tackle here. And that is that nowadays innovation doesn't come from the defense sector anymore like it used to do 40 years ago, whereby you would be experimenting, innovating with government R&D money, with large projects, with known companies, and which would allow you time to work on regulations when it comes down to new technologies, to looking at possible dual use cases, looking at what parts would you like to be commercially exploited. It's completely the other way around nowadays. And a technique like AI has not been on the forefront of the defense radar, whilst it has been growing at a rapid pace around the world. And you already mentioned China, which is working on AI and AI applications at a pace that is unbelievable. So it's a rapid time that we get reacquainted with the community where the innovation happens, that we re-engage, that we look at the possible dual use cases, that we adopt at speed, which means a lot for large defense organizations, and that we protect our technology where we think it needs to be protected against licit and illicit takeovers. And I would say that in all of this, it is crucial that we take our own norms and values into the use of AI. And this is what is going to set us apart from our adversaries. The way we deal with our democratic values, the way we want to have a trusted use of AI, also towards the public, and to be clear towards the private sector. If we can make that the global standard for AI, then I think we're preventing a lot of potential issues in the future.
Yes, thank you for that. And then Commissioner Louie, your thoughts on the subject.
I think this is an important issue. And AI is such a foundational technology. And what I mean by a foundational technology is that it affects everything that it touches, right? It's not just a weapon system or a sensor, but how algorithms may assist humans in decision making, about how information is ingested, right, down to the operational components. And what's interesting about AI is when you're going algorithm versus algorithm, as Bob Work, our vice chair of the commission, points out, this kind of potential algorithmic warfare. In many cases, it's all or nothing. If your AI, just like your humans, have a higher IQ, smarter than your adversaries, then the probability of victory greatly favors those who have that capability. But now we're talking about doing that at machine speeds. So a great example of this is, we all heard about this technology called reinforcement learning as part of the machine learning approach to artificial intelligence. And there was a seminal moment when an algorithm built by a company called DeepMinds built a way to train a computer to beat a human champion in Go. And that had, lots of people's attention, particularly the Chinese. That was kind of their Sputnik moment. But what I think a lot of people missed was later they applied that technology to the game of chess. And they took the best chess algorithm, product and algorithms around this thing called Stockfish, which beat all the humans. It was like 40 or 50 years of understanding of chess, computer science in the way we used to do computer science. And we trained the AlphaGo engine, AlphaZero, to learn chess. And when it competed against Stockfish, it crushed it. The first time, they played 100 games and Stockfish won 0. And then even when they played 1,000 games, they gave Stockfish the opportunity to play in rules that favored itself, more time, more compute. In 1,000 games, it still got crushed. So this is not like marginal improvement. If I'm smarter than you, I win 2% or more of the time. It's 80% of the time, 90% of the time, 100% of the time. So when we say you can't afford to be second is a losing position in many cases as you apply these algorithms.
Thank you for that very descriptive way of showing us, really what the stakes are here and how rapidly policymakers really need to make decisions about how to address this. Because like you say, it's 80 to 90% of the time moving quickly. On that point, ASG Van Wiel, on the NATO side, we've talked about how the coalition is looking to address artificial intelligence and has the strategy coming out in a couple months now. And I do want to talk a bit about how a coalition the size of NATO with 30 members that have a vast spectrum of GDP levels, of technology acumen and specialties, and also varying geopolitical priorities, how you're trying to sort of gather them all together and reach a consensus on how to tackle this technology at the speeds with which Commissioner Louie is expressing are necessary to really get at the problem. And I think, like you mentioned, tackling artificial intelligence is not like building a new aircraft, which is hard enough to do sometimes as a joint program anyway, but there's no real singular focal point. So can you kind of walk us through how NATO is approaching that problem set right now of gathering these 30 nations and reaching a consensus in the time needed?
Yeah, well, you're touching upon the magic of NATO, that we always end up with a unanimous decision, which I would certainly not call the lowest denominator. I think that NATO is, the beauty of NATO is that we manage to rally around the flag at 30 and come up with something that actually is more than the sum of the parts. So one step back. This started in December 2019 when the leaders endorsed the roadmap on EDTs. So basically, that was the starting point when 7 EDTs were delineated as attention points for the alliance, where we needed to work on implementation. And data, AI, and autonomy, I'll pick those 3 out because they're the most urgent, in our opinion, were part of those 7. Some of them are a bit further down the line. If we look at quantum or certain aspects of quantum computing or hypersonics, but AI, data, and autonomy, and of course, in particular, the combination of these 3 need our urgent attention. So the second phase we ventured into was to find a structure of how to deal with EDTs within a large organization like NATO. And that resulted in the EDT implementation strategy that came out and was endorsed in February of this year. And basically what we do there is within these large organizations where we need to build consensus, we've tried to make a framework which enables us to quickly adopt to EDTs that come over the horizon that might be of interest to defense applications, and then apply a strategy of foster and protect to those EDTs in order to get acquainted within NATO as soon as we can with the technology and come to common agreements on all the things that are relevant for all allies. Now, I already mentioned our values and democratic issues, so what we'll try to come up with in the AI strategy is a common set of principles of responsible use. NATO is not a regulator, but NATO is definitely the forum transatlantically where we can discuss and adopt principles that we find important for the use of these new technologies. So basically, we haven't started negotiating these, but what we try to do is get a feel for what's already out there within the alliance, to get a feel for the thoughts in the academic world, in the individual allied nations, and that enables us to get a starting position for negotiations within the alliance to be concluded somewhere this summer. And if you look at where then the added value of NATO lies, I think it's exactly in the points of the principles of responsible use that I mentioned, but it's in commonly building trust that NATO and therefore all NATO nations will use AI in a responsible manner. The added value of NATO lies in interoperability. There are nations far more advanced in the use of AI than others within the alliance, and in the end that will create a two-speed alliance that we would like to stay away from. But we can also use the power of NATO to make an impact in the startup and scale-up community that's dealing with AI, by being visible in these ecosystems, by investing, by providing advice on how to protect intellectual property, and by being there at an early stage so as to be able to identify these defense and security implications of a technology. And referring to what I said earlier, that brings us in a position to commonly take positions on standards. And these standards, for example, it doesn't matter where they're being made for technology. It can be in the UN, it can be in the International Telecoms Organization. But the fact that 30 like-minded countries get together, have the same level of awareness on a technology, and then agree on how they should influence the worldwide regulatory framework, I think is a very important step. So we might take a bit longer than an individual nation, but the end result, I think, is very powerful if it comes to 30 nations.
And how are you, enabling that speed with which you're trying to come to this decision? Are you all, gathering more often virtually, of course, right now. Have you installed new, offices within NATO to just really help speed up this discussion and get to a solution more quickly than you may have even in the past on previous defense initiatives?
Well, part of it in policy making is a matter of focus. And that's why we divided these 7 EDTs into different categories depending on the maturity they're in. So the 3 categories, one is identify. Those are the technologies coming over the horizon that might have an impact at some point, but they are still 10 to 15 years from maturity. But we want to keep an eye on them. So that doesn't take a lot of focus on the policy side. But from an intelligence point of view, from a technological and science point of view, you want to have your full focus on those technologies. Technologies that are more advanced, we put them into the understand phase. And the understand phase allows us to start experimenting, incorporating these technologies at a very small scale into our exercises, into wargaming, and at the same time, gathering more knowledge on how we would like to implement it. So also there, from the policy side, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but it raises our level of awareness and prepares us for the 3rd phase, which we call the act phase. And that's when we get into the strategy and plans phase. And data and AI are the first 2 that will pick up. Also because one without the other doesn't make much sense, so they will go at approximately the same pace. And our full focus now is on getting a strategy on AI ready for the alliance that'll produce very tangible results and will get the alliance to an AI savvy level at record speed. And for that, we need to change things in the organization as well. We need to look at different ways of funding. You were talking about an aircraft, building an aircraft with multiple nations. Those are 10, 20, 30-year projects. And they have tenders that last for years. Well, we're dealing with different kind of industrial speeds here and different players. So we need to look into rapid contracting, to ways of mobilizing venture capital, of becoming active in that field ourselves as NATO. But it also means that we need to look at our screening procedures. If we have to wait for 10 months before we can have a clearance for someone and be able to engage on AI, that might be too late. We need people that actually get AI, including operators, because they will be the ones handling AI-enabled equipment. So there's loads of issues that look trivial but are crucial and that need to be changed in the organization in order to up that speed and to become a smart customer and a smart user, which in these technologies we're not yet.
Absolutely. Commissioner Louie, what are your observations on how the United States specifically has approached the need to invest in artificial intelligence for defense purposes? Do you see, a sort of, do you see them identifying the need properly? Do we have the right offices and people working on the problem set in government that need to be? Do lawmakers understand what's at stake at this point, or does further education need to happen?
Well, I think it's clear that the U.S. is taking this very seriously. Right? It's not just our ability to come up with a 750-page report. It's a great document, but it's a doorstop unless it's implemented. And we're getting bipartisan support. And you heard from the president, focus from the executive branch to move out quickly. And the reason for that is we're not setting the timetable. The U.S. isn't setting the timetable, and NATO isn't setting the timetable. Our competitors are setting the timetable. China has already laid out very distinct dates, 2025, to be competitive with the West in AI, to be by 2030 to 2035, to be superior, and then have the ability by 2049 to win in any fight, in any domain, anywhere in the world. So they've set that timetable for us. And they have already implemented their version of, cooperation, as as we might call it, in their military civil fusion requirements for the companies. So they're already rapidly integrating what's coming out of their commercial world. So for the US and for our NATO and our ally countries, what we have to do is rethink about how we do things at the foundational level. So in the United States, we did some work before the AI Commission completed. We took a look at things like software and data and acquisition. And we found that, software isn't hardware, isn't developed the same way. And AI is fundamentally data and algorithms and software. And so we need to relook at this because it's a never-ending process. We don't buy and should not buy software like the way we buy aircraft. I think the second thing is on this timetable is to leverage what we already have. We have great companies, not just in the US, in places like Canada and Europe. The Total Alliance has tremendous capabilities. We don't need to replicate what they're doing. What we need to do is leverage what they're doing and encourage them with either our buying power or being challenging, to challenge them on the challenges we see as problems that fit with their solutions, and come up with a rapid approach to take those solutions and integrate it in a way that serves our alliance's defense and security requirements in a very, very rapid way. Now, there's one of the things we did realize, besides, because AI can be very sexy. Engineers love sexy technology. You give them an opportunity to work on an algorithm, the R&D, the S&T people, they all rally around because it's really, really cool stuff. But it turns out, well, that's important. And quite frankly, we don't have to encourage a lot of that because our workforces and our companies are already hitting down that particular path. And same for our research institutions. It's the boring stuff. It's the infrastructure things. Are we ready? Do we have the infrastructure to move large data around? Do we have the interoperability standards so that we don't find ourselves in a fight where our systems can't talk and share information with each other? It is the nitty-gritty of making sure that our workforce actually understands how to use AI like the way they use a video game. It's amazing, as we're kind of going through the commission report and our thinking, is that we're saying, how do we get our workforce to even comprehend how to use AI, on a daily basis? And yet our war fighters are playing Fortnite in the middle of the evening. They're already using AI, right? They're already in, League of Legends. They've been using AI for 20 years. Our military has not. So we have the capacity to come up to speed. We have the capacity to meet the 2027 if we get out of our own way. So there's a lot of sexy things we can do, but we shouldn't get, like kids running to a soccer ball or to a football, like where they all kind of gather around, they all, well, that's the ball, we'll all go around. Let's be very thoughtful. Leverage the resources we already have, the talent, the companies, the research that our allies are already doing. Have faster approaches on streamlining acquisition. Invest in foundational infrastructure that allows for more rapid development of these algorithms and implementation, and level the playing field. So it's not just the big companies and the big research and the big countries who can tap into that. Have that common foundational layer where people can take the best talent, best technologies, and apply what we already have today to get ahead, not just of our timetable, but our adversaries' timetables.
Definitely. Well, on that point too, Commissioner Louis, since you mentioned the timetable that we're on right now and all of these, approaches that need to be taken in the meantime, and then going back to what ASG Van Weel was saying about the priorities that are being set out by the Alliance, the science and technology trends through 2030, Commissioner Louis, how do you see those emerging and disruptive technology priorities NATO has put out through 2020 or 2030, intersecting with the AI efforts that the United States is already performing at the national level? where's the complementary action there?
Well, I think a lot of the things that are in the NATO vision, right? That's very strongly consistent with our view, right? The interoperability, the ability to share, the ability to think about things that are going to happen 25 years from now and the things that are happening today and everything in between, about coming up with a rapid deployment strategy. I think there's some things though that we need to do that to kind of like speed up this particular process, right? One is leverage their infrastructure and your sources of S&T that you already have. I know we had the same problem in the US. Our natural instinct, whenever there's a problem, is to create a new thing, create a new entity, right? We have a cyber attack, so therefore we need to have a new commission, and then we need to have new structures around that. We should leverage the structures wherever possible that we already have, because it's easier to enrich existing structures than create all new ones, because you have to create new ConOps, you got to train, you get people together, right? You already have talent. So that's number one. Number two is think of a whole of an alliance approach, not just whole of nation approach, right? Or whole of government approaches, right? So in many places, like in the US, for example, we have these kind of regulatory environments. We say, yes, we can share with other countries, but we may not be able to share with other countries' companies. We may, we can only take dollars, but there's no talent equivalent. So I think we should take an inventory of all 30 countries of what we already have. Number two, leverage both the commercial sector and our academic and S&T infrastructure, right? We don't need to invent what those companies and institutions are already going to build and research anyway, right? We need to find out where the gaps are, fill in the gaps, and use our buying power to accelerate implementation. And quite frankly, get rid of the red tape. If it takes a year to buy something, because that's our buying cycle, right? Imagine if you have a phone that updated itself only once a year. Like, we would never think about that, right? But we do that in our military systems and our defense systems. So I think there are a lot of things that we should be doing besides the big ideas, what I call the grout, the things that hold the bricks together. We need to focus in on the grout to streamline the processes to make that timetable. Because, look, we can have the best technologies in the world. If we can't get it into our systems, or we can even get into our systems, but if we don't know how to have our people who know how to use those systems in a disruptive way. Remember, our adversaries are not going to try to incrementally be better than us. They're going to try to use highly disruptive approaches to use this new technology in things like information operations, to highly hybrid warfare strategies, right? Cyber, things that are low investments to have high impact. So for us, we have to be willing to disrupt our own organizations, and that's probably the hardest thing, particularly with military institutions. The last thing we want to do is disrupt our way of which we've been thinking about the problem, right? Our esprit de corps we hold dear to ourselves because it's who we are on the military and intelligence side. But if we don't let go of some of these ideas, we don't have the luxury of inventing an airplane in the beginning of the 19th century and not figuring out for 40 years later on how to use it. We don't have that timetable with AI. We had to compress decades into months. And so there's a lot of work in front of us.
Absolutely. ASG Van Weel, what are your thoughts on some of those additional points that Commissioner Louie brought up? Might we see some of those recommendations or recommendations addressing those points in the AI strategy coming out?
Definitely, and I think that one of the points that also struck me is that a lot of the most important work here is not necessarily the sexy stuff. So yes, it is about having a data framework policy in place, It is about having the digital backbone, which enables you to actually run these AI applications across the alliance. It is about leveraging those innovation ecosystems that are present in our countries. And it is about leveraging the knowledge that already exists within our nations in our companies. Companies like Google and Facebook have gazillions are light years ahead of the defense organizations when it comes down to using and developing AI. But they're on our side, I would say, and they're willing to work with us. So as long as we delineate what we expect, that we make sure that we have agile processes in place and the infrastructure that needs to work on, and that we create trust in the way that NATO handles AI and data for that aspect and autonomy, and especially the combination of those three, then I think that there's a lot to be leveraged already, and that can be mobilized in the shorter run in order to catch up.
And again, NATO does at least have the benefit of long history of interoperability and having your partners develop and adhere to standards to ensure that all of your allies are able to communicate and operate the same sort of equipment. So you already have that mindset in mind. So that's certainly helpful. Commissioner Louie, on the US side, I know that there has been a longstanding back and forth and a little bit of a struggle on the DoD side when it came to working with the commercial sector for a while in terms of who owns the intellectual property, how much of a certain system, remains in the care and keep of the industry versus the operator. Can you talk a bit about how you've seen that progressing? Has the DoD and the national security sector, kind of lessened up their determination to have control over that? And how, going into that, what more opportunities do you see for the private sector on both sides of the Atlantic to work on this problem set with DoD and NATO?
Well, clearly there's still more work to be done. But here's some good news. I think the US has learned alternative methods of doing acquisitions, or what we call our other transaction authorities, OTAs, has had a major impact on how we think about acquisitions, right? We see today more smaller companies playing than we ever had in the past, right? Our cyber programs are robust. Even our venture programs, the few that we have, right? Whether it's a more traditional venture model like InQtel or a hybrid model like DIU, right, is showing that we can use these alternative strategies that protects IP of the inventors as they deploy those solutions into our military and intelligence systems. Now, we're not all the way there, particularly on the big programs, right? Like, if you build a piece of technology for a military system by a big defense contractor, and they use their IRAD dollars to build that, right? Does the government have the ability to take that and give it to another company? And there's a lot of reasonable concerns on both sides, and that needs to get solved. But we're seeing that is not getting in the way, and things are like AI, right? Because of these OTAs. So I think if NATO, the 30 member nations, right, come up with some additional strategies for rapid deployment. Now, the other side that's really powerful, by the way, is that buying power. If you think about the NATO buying power, the US government is the largest buyer of IT in the world, right? And you combine that with our other NATO members. If you have a company to say, I got a great idea here, and I can demonstrate that. If we can have a fast track where member countries can all together say, we want that, we're willing to back that, right? Now, instead of doing it on a country by country basis, right, we can speed up not only the development of these technologies, but now we're going to have an ability to have companies who will gravitate to these kinds of uses as first use cases, not third use cases. And I know there's been a debate whether or not that will come true, but this was the debate when we started In-Q-Tel back in 1999, that nobody would show up on our doorstep, right? And it turns out that once companies realize that working with the government can lead to bigger and bigger procurements and new use cases that they can take back out into the commercial world, we created an environment of that trust, right? And an ability to accelerate things. So I think we have the ability to do it. I think NATO has a unique ability to do it, given its 30 member nations. So, my personal point of view, instead of creating new institutions, instead of creating new venture funds or new capital funds, right? Put more emphasis on the acquisition streamlining, the ability to broadcast needs, and to allow member nations to get their ecosystems, right? Give them the tools where it helps those ecosystems to become successful by working with other member nations. If we do that, I will tell you, my personal belief is that the Chinese will not be able to compete with us. We will beat them in hardware. We will beat them in talent, right? And while they may have some short-term advantages in data, I actually think we will have the long-term advantages in data, because our view, our democratic and responsible use of that data, the protection of that data, the respect of individual rights around that data, in the long run will lead us to better approaches on AI than trying to ingest a world of collections as a way to train up a system.
Wonderful. We do only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through just a couple more questions real quick. You've both talked about the need to establish, a responsible use situation or responsible use policy. And I feel like that is definitely something that needs to be well established almost from the start of, as soon as these policy directives are out. Of course, NATO nations among themselves have different opinions about how to use AI in warfare, how to use an AI-enabled drone. So for ASG Van Wheel first, you talked a little bit about this earlier in the month at an online event hosted by the Estonian Defense Ministry, but will this AI strategy and will NATO try to answer this question of where the responsibility of an AI system lies, in the operator or the manufacturer? Are you going to try and answer that question in this strategy? And is that NATO's role to determine?
Well, let me first state that the specific use case that is often portrayed in this debate, namely the use of killer drones, autonomous killer drones, is a very, very, very small part of the total use of AI within the alliance and the nations. Most of it will be in support of decision making, will be in logistics, will be in enterprise HR support. So to focus the whole debate on these few possibilities of the lethal use of force is narrowing the debate. That being said, these principles need to apply to all AI, wherever you use it. And things like responsibility and accountability are certainly ideas of principles that would need to be part of this whole set. So from that aspect, wherever you use AI, you would like to be able to trace back where a possible unintended outcome derived from. And hold somebody accountable for that. I think that it is not that difficult to agree on these principles. I think it is harder when you start to operationalize them. So how do you actually make sure that and verify in a trustworthy way towards the public that you've actually looked at a piece of AI through the lens of your principles, and that you have a solid process in place to create the trust that this piece of AI does adhere to those principles. And then it doesn't really matter on where you use that technology, because you will have your principles embedded in it.
Right. Thank you for that. Commissioner Louie, your thoughts on this subject of trying to determine where the responsibility lies?
I think it's an important topic. I think it's a shared responsibility. Ultimately, the commanders who deploy or the individuals who deploy the technology has to be responsible for the use of that technology, right? So if I'm going to deploy a system as it is today as a commander, right, I take responsibility of that system, right, for for both its inherent limitations and the application of that particular technology in that particular moment. I think the second part of this is, which is really critical, is the testing and the evaluation, right, of these systems, right? We have not well thought through in many cases of how to test these systems. And so again, that's the boring part. People like to build things. People always hate testing things, right? The old way of testing things, go out to a test range, fly it 20 times, instrument it, and see how it does, is an antiquated model. We need to be able to digitally test these, run them a billion iterations, not a dozen iterations. We need to see what the outcomes are, right? We need to look at the inputs to make sure there aren't biases in how we're putting these systems together, or our adversaries have poisoned the information, right? We need also, as military services and intelligence services and as governments, hold our most senior folks responsible for making sure that they have appropriate oversight before they authorize these systems into our inventories. They cannot just simply pass it to a mid-level career or a mid-level officers to make those kinds of decisions. So these are really important things that needs to be done. It's not simply, do you hold the company responsible or do you hold the commander responsible? Everybody in that chain needs to carry the responsibility in order to make sure that the deployment of these systems, right, do less harm than the non-deployment of these systems. And let me just say that the measure isn't the system measuring the system in isolation, it's measuring the system versus its current alternatives. So if a system basically that you deploy creates higher risk than your existing systems, why would you do that? But if you can create a system that more adheres to the principles of the international IHL, more adheres to the ethical principles that drive NATO, then why wouldn't you deploy it? As long as you have the confidence that it is going to do what it's advertised to do, and that goes back to the testing regime.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I feel like we're ending this on a very suspenseful topic, but more to come with this later event. Thank you so much to both of you, to Assistant Secretary General David Van Weel and Commissioner Gilman-Louie. Thank you so much for your expertise and your answers here. And I hope all of you watching look forward to the rest of this great event on transatlantic cooperation on artificial intelligence. Thank you again to SEPA and to NSCAI for hosting. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Mehta. I am Deputy Editor and Pentagon Correspondent with Defense News. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And thank you to SEPA for putting together this great event. We have an excellent panel of expertise lined up here. Before we get started, the only thing that can make this panel any possibly better would be getting questions from the audience. Obviously, we wish we could be doing this in person, calling on people in person. The good thing is, thanks to the magic of Zoom, we do have an option. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A button. A couple people have already been sending stuff in. That's great. Please start sending questions in right away. We're going to talk amongst ourselves for a little bit here in the panel, and then we're going to make sure we have time to get to questions, try to hit as many of them as possible over the next little over an hour that we have to work here. Please give a warm digital round of applause for our excellent panel today, including General Sir Patrick Sanders, who is the head of the United Kingdom Strategic Command. Sir Patrick joined the military in 1986, served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kosovo, and has held a number of top positions throughout the armed forces. We're also joined by Matt Cordova from the Global Cooperation Team of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Over the course of his career, Matt has served in a number of national security roles, including as an advisor to two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kadi Silda joins us from Estonia. She's the Undersecretary for Defense Policy in the Estonian Ministry of Defense, a job she took in January of 2019. As part of that job, she works to build defense relations between Estonia and the EU, NATO, UN, US, and all of its partners and allies. Dr. Ulrika Franke is the leader of the Technology and European Policy Center at the European Council on Foreign Relations. There, she studies the impact of new technologies such as drones and artificial intelligence on geopolitics and warfare. And I think if anybody follows this space on Twitter, she's a well-known personality there as well, has been greatly helpful for a number of reporters. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Anne Bouvereau, who is the Senior Advisor for Towerbrook Capital Partners, who has an extensive background in telecommunications and IT industry experience. She also holds a PhD in artificial intelligence, making her far, far too qualified to talk to someone like me about this, but we're going to do our best. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. To all our panelists, I'm going to start with maybe a big picture question to kind of kick things off here. And maybe Sir Patrick, you can be the first to respond, and then we'll go around the horn a little bit. In your mind, is it a bigger obstacle for AI adoption at a transatlantic level? Is it a technical issue or is it a political issue? And depending on what your answer is, maybe what's the single biggest hurdle that needs to be addressed?
Thanks, Aaron. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be on the panel and such a distinguished one. And perhaps uniquely on this panel, I am self-evidently not a scientist or a policymaker. I'm an operator. And as you said, I command an organization called Strategic Command. And my responsibilities include defending our networks, our military networks in cyberspace, and projecting cyber effects. And increasingly, as I look at the future, I'm not going to be able to do that effectively without AI. I'm responsible for intelligence and special forces. I'm not going to be able to exploit data and create understanding at the pace we need to without AI. And crucially, I'm responsible for something we call multi-domain integration. So across those 5 operational domains, we're going to be facing threats at machine speeds and a volume that are simply beyond human capability to handle. And we're going to need AI for it. So I feel a very personal and operational imperative for the combat applications as well as AI's use for defending society. I mean, if you give me a second, just to describe where we are in the UK at the moment. As you know, we've just published an integrated review, and that described the competition that we're in that we all recognize. I always think that Bob Work's really good here because he talks about this being a technological competition, but he also talks about it being a values competition. And there are 2 of the 4 objectives that come out of that review that I think are directly relevant to what we're talking today. The government's ambition is to shape the open international order of the future, particularly around emerging technology. And secondly, to sustain strategic advantage through science and technology. And itself set itself a pretty bold ambition, a specific one, to be recognized for the UK, to be recognized as a science and technology superpower, remaining at least 3rd in the world for scientific research and innovation, and having established a leading edge in critical areas such as AI. So we have got some particular advantages, we the UK, and I think ourselves as allies. For our case, and you can clearly see it across the Atlantic, there's clear political ambition and hunger and appetite. We have, as the previous speakers were describing, a remarkable R&D sector, and we've got what I think is our superpower. We can't compete with autocracies and some of the advantages they have, but our superpower is our allies, is our alliances. And so we've got to make sure that in this particular area, as this panel gets after today, we are strengthening those alliances because it makes us unbeatable ultimately. To your specific question, I mean, there is a very straightforward answer around the technological obstacle, and it was referred to previously on. For me, it is around the digital foundations, the digital infrastructure. And so to that end, part of this commission that we've been given on the back of the IR is for my organization to build a secure, modern, and digital backbone. And that includes getting after data, and it includes building an AI center. But your question, I think, is right, the inference, your question. For me, although that's key, it's foundational, actually the biggest obstacles for me are non-technical. They're around talent, clearly, growing the sort of talent that we were talking about in the previous, in the keynote speaking. But actually the biggest one is making sure that as an alliance, as partners, we have a common language and we have a common understanding about what we mean by AI, how we can exploit it so that we can build trust. And I'm struck by some of the early conversations we had around offensive cyber in NATO, where there were, sometimes as many as 30 different interpretations of what offensive cyber was and its benefits. And we've got to overcome that hurdle to make sure that there is more or less universal agreement in the alliance around what the benefits of exploiting AI are, so that we can then build the sort of norms that our Prime Minister was describing in the integrated review and behave as a responsible AI power and a responsible AI alliance. Because if we can establish those norms, then we will be in a better place. The prescription for me, it's really simple. I think the only way we clean NATO's pipes in this is to learn by doing. We start getting after some operational use cases and we learn from the process of doing it. I'll hand back to you, Aaron.
Great, thanks, sir. Matt, do you want to take this one next?
Sure, thanks, Aaron, and thanks to my colleagues, distinguished colleagues, for joining us today. I think my comments will align with General Sanders for the most part here. Secretary Blinken met today with EU High Representative for Foreign Policy Borrell, and I think the real headline out of this series of meetings is that the United States and the EU in particular really need to focus on areas of convergence. And over the last couple of years, I think we've become a little enamored by areas of divergence. Clearly, we're going to need to address both to move our collaborative agenda forward. But I would bring it back to the point that General Sanders raised in terms of, I call it Nike, just do it. It's time to start doing concrete collaborations. And the transatlantic relationship on AI has been a little bit bogged down by the lack of concreteness, in particular across a range of sectors, whether on the R&D spectrum, the application spectrum, and some other areas. So I think we've got to try to find some areas where we can work constructively on particular big use cases, as well as some of the foundational elements. Clearly, issues like privacy are important. The United States is struggling with those nationally. The EU as well, across member states, but transatlantically as well, and as well as with our friends in Canada. So I think what this comes down to is we've got to realize that convergence is really an imperative. In the absence of trying to find areas of convergence, we have a very determined competitor that is quite anxious to see us continue to diverge, and quite anxious really to put both the United States and Europe to sleep economically and technologically. So we think it's in our imperative ultimately to find areas of accommodation in some of these touchy issues, particularly with respect to privacy, privacy preserving machine learning techniques, those kinds of things, and then build concrete agendas. For instance, there's some great work that's being done by the Nordics and Baltics with respect to maritime domain awareness that uses a number of machine learning and artificial intelligence technologies and techniques. Those are the kind of things that if we could construct collaborations between the United States and Europe, not only could we improve collaboration, we could enhance the economic, the political, as well as the security posture of both to compete with, again, I will emphasize, a very determined, a very capable, and a very thoughtful competitor. So I'll turn it back to you, Aaron. Those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And I'm going to come back to the question of competitor, because I think that's something that ties into a lot of this. Kadi, do you want to take the next go at this question?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be on this very distinguished panel. Estonia has been successful in adopting tech, because essentially when we regained our independence, we were small, we were poor, we had no alternative but to be more risk averse and basically gutsy. And I think the question you've asked, my answer would be that yes, it's a technical issue, but it's also a political issue, and it's a mindset issue. I described, Estonia's sort of transition, and I think we need to realize that in AI alone, we are all too small, and we are in a way too slow. And what I mean by that, first, data. That's been mentioned quite a few times. This is one of the main obstacles, and this is what we're working on both in NATO and EU to make sure that we share defense-related data among allies. Secondly, NATO and EU cannot do things separately. Again, we will be too fragmented, we will be too small. We talk about NATO-EU cooperation on emerging and disruptive tech, but and we've been doing that for quite a few years now. But still, we lack. EDT is not on the NATO-EU cooperation list of cooperation activities, of which there are 74. So we need some sort of a transatlantic tech coalition. I'm agnostic in terms of how it looks and how it's done, but for sure we need something. Third, and this pertains to speed, we need to be quicker at adopting solutions from the lab to the field. And I think one of the opportunities that we need to take a harder look at in terms of how we use it is our enhanced forward presence battle groups. Of course, the technology that you can use there cannot be at a very low TRL level, that's clear, but you could really, as we say in Estonia, kill a few bees with one slap, as you could both test it in a relatively safe environment, and you could look and take lessons for interoperability, as the battle groups are quite interoperable. And then finally, and again this pertains to speed, and was mentioned by many speakers, we need to move at the speed of the commercial world, and devise new means of pulling commercial technology into defense. And NATO is taking steps there. The EU is taking steps there with our new communication on civil and military synergies. But again, we need to be taking these steps together. Thank you very much.
I think we're starting to hear a couple of trends here around speed and the need to move quickly. Dr. Franke, I'd love your thoughts on this top question.
Yes, thanks a lot, and good afternoon from London. Thanks for putting on this great discussion. I'll keep this very brief. I see two main obstacles at the moment when it comes to transatlantic cooperation on military AI, if you want to call it like that. And the first one is that Europeans aren't united. So we talked about 30 NATO members, 28 of which I guess are Europeans. And what I definitely see in my work in Europe is that you have some European countries that really think about this a lot, about how to integrate AI in the military realm, and are doing this. And some countries for which this is still relatively new. And when you look at kind of national AI strategies, you realize very quickly that only a handful of countries, if even that, mention military AI in their thinking. So I think it's not so much that there's a lot of disagreement at this part in Europe, but it's just that there's a big difference in terms of how prepared some Europeans are and how much they're thinking about this. And I think this is a problem both for the EU, but also for NATO. And the second kind of hurdle I see is that there is a certain skepticism among some Europeans towards the US. And this isn't just or primarily a kind of post-Trump thing. I think it's a post-Snowden thing. I think there is still a kind of concern about privacy, about working together. There's definitely a concern when it comes to things like lethal autonomous weapon systems. How careful is the US really? And then finally, and this really kind of was very well shown in the first panel, I think some Europeans are a bit worried about the very, I want to say gung-ho, or kind of very confrontational way that the US is approaching military AI with regard to China, right? I mean, things like, the second is not an option. It's all about military dominance. It's really funny because I spend a lot of my time kind of telling Europeans that, you need to think more geopolitically. You need to think about these competitions, but I want to at the same time kind of tell the Americans to maybe tone it down a little bit, because that doesn't work so well with regard to a European audience. I'll keep it at these 2 points, but these are the things I kind of think about and worry about a bit.
Certainly never heard Americans described as gung-ho before. That's great, thanks. Dr. Bouvereau, do you want to try to wrap up this opening question?
Well, wrapping it up, I'm not sure, but I'll try to continue. And actually, I'm very happy to take it from where Dr. Franco left it, because I tend to agree that there's a first subject, which is Europe and Europe's approach to AI. Before we then moved to NATO, and it was alluded to one of the questions in the Q&A. Europe is actually trying to get its views around AI as a region. And you've seen some attempts at regulation with the Digital Services Act. And it's actually step 2 after the privacy laws of GDPR that were really the first attempt in Europe to put some sort of framework around the value of privacy and respect of personal data on the internet, even before AI was the word that was being used. And that's really the most often what people in Europe discuss when they discuss about AI, and not so much the corporate cooperation with NATO or on defense subjects. And I know that privacy is seen a bit differently in the US, and of course, post Snowden and Facebook is not that popular even in the US currently. So GDPR is something that is being adopted more globally, but more as a let's use this thing that seems to solve our problem that we've just realized we had, rather than really being ingrained in the way of thinking. And that's the way privacy and GDPR is in Europe. In a way, in itself, I think GDPR, for all the value that as a European I see in it, and actually I've co-founded a foundation, Fondation Abeona, that looks at social impact of AI, and privacy and lack of bias and discrimination are things that are very dear to me. If you look at innovation, startups, the ability to launch new business models or new products, and it's been alluded to, GDPR is actually, it's a good thing, but it slows innovation down compared to people in other geographies, and for example in China. So that in itself is maybe the different perception around that is probably another obstacle, but I'll stop there.
Great. Well, that's, I mean, a lot to build off of here. I think maybe a good place to start with is I want to talk about the competition question. We certainly saw under the Trump administration, and it has continued under the Biden administration so far, a focus on China as the 1A big competitor for the United States, which has been something of a discussion with Europe, because of course, even while many in Europe acknowledge the risks and potential dangers of a rising China, Russia is right there. And in many cases, the economic partnerships with China can trump some of the security concerns from the US. So when it comes to AI specifically, I'm wondering how the US maybe needs to approach this discussion, per Dr. Franco's comments about whether it's pushing too hard, and whether in Europe there really is a consensus that China needs to be the big concern when it comes to AI, or if there's more of a concern about what Russia might be doing, or Russia potentially stealing technology. And Matt, maybe we can start with you on this, just how to approach Europe from a US angle with a focus on China, how to approach Europe and make sure everyone's kind of on the same page about this.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think if you look at the body of work of our commission and what we produced, we took an expansive approach to defining national security. And what we do, and we are very clear-eyed about the military threat posed by China, we're also very clear-eyed about the values competition that technology competition is. And so if you look at the report and what we propose a very broad set of recommendations across government institutions, public-private collaboration, things we need, as we've characterized, to be AI ready by 2025. There's a tremendous sense of urgency that we're trying to generate in the United States, as well as with our allies and partners. The Chinese have this, and they've captured it. The second piece that I would add is the Chinese actually have a very positive narrative about AI. Grandmothers on the streets use mobile payment systems with great comfort. That is remarkable. If you look at the United States and Europe, we have a very different narrative and set of narratives about AI and associated technologies. Our Commission Chair, Eric Schmidt, notes that AI and the associated stack of technologies are going to create trillion-dollar industries, much the way the internet and all of those offshoots created billion-dollar industries that became, the things that we see prospering now. It is in our collective interest among like-minded democracies to ensure that not only the technical standards, but the underlying values that are driving these industries are done so in a responsible and ethical way that comports with democratic values. I think fundamentally, the primary difference that our Commission sees, I think, between the Chinese approach and Western approaches to AI is fundamentally we see AI as a technology that empowers governments to be responsible to their people and the people that elect them. The Chinese case, I think, is a much different case about using technologies like AI to ensure that people and citizens are responsible to their governments. It is a completely different paradigm. And I think that is the fundamental element of geopolitical competition that we've got to find a way to converge with practical examples, with concrete collaborations, and the appropriate accommodations in areas like GDPR, privacy, and other regulations. These are going to be very tough conversations. But I will tell you, our Commission's perspective on this is they're necessary conversations. The absence of these conversations, we know that our Chinese competitors won't be having these conversations because they're trying to put us out of business. And that's a position that neither the United States, Europe, nor Canada, as well as our Asian allies, want to be in.
Anne, I saw you shaking your head at one point. I didn't know if you wanted to maybe jump in on here.
Yeah, with pleasure. And it's addressing also one of the questions in the Q&R a little bit. It's Europe has tried, maybe a bit less now, but has tried to position itself a little bit with the US clearly as a super important ally, but also somehow independently and with relationships with Asia and with China, and different countries in Europe have had different positions there. I think there's slowly a bigger recognition amongst the general public that yes, China is a formidable competitor, but there's also, and it's Snowden and it's other things, this fear of the way AI is being used and developed by companies that are US based, and that the privacy risks are actually privacy risks that are also seen as coming from US-based companies. And I think to your point, Matt, of the perception on AI, people in Europe are afraid of AI, and they're afraid of AI because of the privacy risks, but also because of the name and because of science fiction movies and horrible stories. So it's not at all the story that you were recounting for China. One of the things that we're doing in France with Institut Montaigne is we've launched a free online MOOC on AI called Destination AI, to explain to people what AI is, what the risks are, what the opportunities are, and really to demystify it. Because as long as we have the general public afraid of what AI is, we're not going to be able to push as much as we would want to for speedy implementation and collaboration and things like this.
It's interesting, Kadi. Yeah, I was actually going to come to you, so I'm happy you wanted to raise your hand there. Partly because I think Estonia maybe has a different relation in the public sphere to AI than perhaps the US or other parts in Europe do. But also, again, back to the question of competitors. While Estonia has agreed in comments about China being a major concern and needing to technologically match with it, Russia is literally on the border and by nature has to remain the top threat. So how do you balance those two issues?
Thank you. And not that we underestimate China, but the difference between China and Russia in this sense is that yes, of course, no one disagrees that the Chinese are technologically more advanced in this area, no doubt about it. But the main problem in the Chinese armed forces is that they lack combat experience. It's well known, widely known. So their ability to adapt this technology and use this technology well and effectively for their armed forces is somewhat of a question. Whereas the Russians, of course, are technologically, they're at a much more lower level, but we see them adopting the technology. We've seen them use it in Syria, for example. They take lessons from it, and they adopt these lessons and adapt. So.
Fair enough. Ulrike, did you have a comment you wanted to make, and then we'll go to Sir Patrick, and we'll just round it out that way.
Yeah, great. Just one point, which is, I think it's really important in this discussion to differentiate between military AI, so AI used in the military realm, and AI more broadly, because the competition is very different. So from a European point of view, when we're talking about military AI, then of course it makes sense that we look at China, and we are looking at China, and Russia does play a role. I think Kadi mentioned this. I think it's mainly in the kind of AI-enabled or even not AI-enabled disinformation and cyber realm, maybe more than in the kind of classic military systems realm. But the situation is quite different when it comes to AI more broadly, because then all of a sudden, Europe basically needs to look both ways, if that makes sense. So because when it comes to AI more generally, for Europe, China isn't really the main competitor. It's actually the US. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not, this isn't an opponent, a kind of adversarial relationship in the way that, the US and Chinese relationship is. But when it comes to European AI, we look at the US as the kind of main competitor, the kind of yardstick against to measure ourselves and all of that. And China also plays a role, but yeah, we look both ways, but that's not the case in military AI. So I think we just need to make sure that we kind of get these differences right.
Great point. Thanks. Sir Patrick, do you want to?
So Aaron, thanks. You asked the question, what we should be saying as Europeans. I'm clearly speaking now as a geographical European rather than as a political European. I won't go further than that. I know you want the question to be about competition, but I just wanted to talk very briefly about opportunity and return to this theme that resonates quite strongly, that was picked up in our integrated review about science and technology. And I think there's an opportunity off the back of our experiences in the last year and a half to exploit what we've learned from the pandemic, and the importance of science and technology has come home to roost in a way our general population perhaps hadn't appreciated at any other time. The fact that medical technology and vaccines can make such a difference to people's lives means that you get this resonance. And if we're talking about the opportunity that AI presents, you talk about how AI is such an accelerant of all of the different science and technology streams and disruptive technologies we're pursuing. You begin to get some resonance in the narrative there. And rather than talking about AI as something remote, talk about it in terms of human-machine teaming, how AI can augment intelligence, augment human performance, support humans, remove the burden from them, whether that's in danger on operations or whether it's just in the drudgery of day-to-day life. And you begin to get much more people listening to the narrative. There is a very real sense where competition, that competition you're describing to, does play out. Certainly in the UK, I know it does more broadly. And that, of course, is a Russian misuse of cyberspace, particularly when it comes to misinformation and disinformation, not least in the pandemic. And there is an expectation from the British public that they're protected from that. And if you describe to them how AI can help protect them from that, then you begin to get a more receptive and fertile ground.
It's a great, interesting point. I want to build a little bit off that and talk about kind of actual use cases in this case. So both Sir Patrick and Matt in their opening comments talked about the idea of what Matt said, just do it, right? It's time to start putting these things into action. Kadi mentioned potentially doing something with the enhanced forward presence. Maybe Sir Patrick, we'll start with you again. Just can you point to maybe one or two actual cases where you can say, look, we know this technology is workable enough that we can actually test it. Let's get this either in the field or actively in the labs in some sort of transatlantic setting and actually prove some of this stuff out? You know, what's the low-hanging fruit that can actually start being worked on now?
So I saw the question that was asked, which sort of asked me to say one thing, and it's simply saying everything isn't an answer. But that's a bit like saying to a car manufacturing company that when you apply AI to your car, you can only design a lane system. You can't do anything else. So I'm afraid the answer is a lot of areas. And there is a lot of progress being made already. So one of the obvious places to point to is around object recognition and how you can apply that in intelligence. So we know that we have hours, years, decades of full motion video footage, and we're often staring at one spot to look for something where there's been a change in a pattern or there's a threat emerging. You can, and we do, apply AI there. So I think AI in intelligence is a very obvious place to start, because you've got the data, you can make very rapid gains and advances, and there's already some good partnering with the US and with other close allies in that area. The other place you can start, which isn't particularly controversial and people would recognize, is around some basic autonomy. So whether it's last mile delivery, whether it's logistics systems, anything you can do that removes people from harm's way. And if we'd had AI 10 years ago at the start of Afghanistan, some of the soldiers that I saw killed or wounded on dusty roads in Afghanistan because we were expecting them to clear IEDs with a pointed stick or a metal detector that was basically no more advanced than what their forefathers had in the Second World War. You wouldn't have had to go there. So that's a very obvious place to go as well. And then the one that's closest to my heart, not least because I've experienced the sort of shock and paralysis of decision-making on operations where suddenly multiple threats come at you at once, is support to the decision-making. And it's such an obvious place you can go, not least because of the technology that exists in the gaming industry, and we can build on it. And that is an area where we are looking to answer, Kadi, and I might see you in Estonia in 10 days' time, Kadi, where we are looking to bring that to EFP.
That up. Oh, sorry. Kadi, do you want to follow that one up?
Yes, thanks a lot. Situational awareness has been mentioned already. I mean, so far, what we've done is more of the, you know, on the scale of dirty, dull, and dangerous, the dirty and dull stuff. So this idea of killer robots, I think sometimes people assume we're better than we are. But of course, work is going on also on autonomous and semi-autonomous ground vehicles. We're starting to work on semi-autonomous surface vessels, but much remains to be done there. Of course, we are looking at how to apply AI to cyber exercises, for example, and one area that's been highlighted by quite a few, I think the US as well, and we're talking about that in NATO as well, is the possible use cases of AI for military mobility, which we're also very interested in.
Great. Dr. Bouvereau, do you want to go next?
Yes, with pleasure. Maybe I'll just mention one example, not trying to be exhaustive at all, but object recognition or people recognition or looking at movement of people, all the grades before facial recognition, because once I've said facial recognition, then you get into a big privacy area. I think there's a lot you can do with artificial intelligence in terms of recognizing shapes, patterns in movement and still. And you have ways to implement those technologies in privacy respecting way, even if you start looking at people, because you can, and sorry, that's a little bit technical, but if you do local computing very close to the camera without uploading information up onto big databases, you can actually do most of the analysis or all of the analysis you want if you have enough hardware or enough computing power. You can do that locally, and you can, in European GDPR respectful way, still implement those technologies. And therefore, while there's a high level of awareness and doubt and fear around, especially once you say facial recognition, I think around those technologies, there's a lot that you can do without entering those very high-risk areas. And I take it from General Sanders, because that's really for him to say or for others. But I do think this can be hugely useful already in this way.
Great. Dr. Franke and then Matt. And then we're going to start, just as programming, we're going to start trying to get some of the Q&A in there. So if you've been holding on to a question, now's the time to start submitting it. Thanks, Dr. Franke.
Yeah, just to reiterate the point about logistics. I'd say the low-hanging fruit for NATO when it comes to using AI-enabled military systems is to work together on logistics. Is logistics the most impactful, the most revolutionary way of integrating AI in the military realm? No, I don't think so. But I think it makes much more sense for the alliance to not focus on the super hard, the super complex, and the very controversial stuff, but kind of start again with the low-hanging fruit. And logistics really, I think, can pave the way, kind of show the alliance where they can work together. It definitely helps with interoperability, so that's great. And so, yeah, that has my vote in terms of low-hanging fruit.
Well, and logistics also has the added benefit of being something that crosses between NATO and the EU in a lot of ways, the military mobility actions. Matt, why don't you?
I think before moving into use cases, there's still a lot of foundational work that needs to be done in NATO. Infrastructure, information technology, talent and expertise on the NATO international staff, as well as among the individual allied nations. So there's a set of foundational work, and Gilman spoke to this during his presentation, that we really need to ensure that we don't lose focus and move too quickly. Now, in parallel, I think some of the use cases that have been mentioned make sense. And I think in the summit deliverable, it would be useful for NATO to think about articulating some of those use cases. I think from a United States perspective, we would want to ensure that those use cases cover probably a range of military activities, whether at the enterprise level, the operational level, or the headquarters level. And there's a combination of those activities, I think, that could be usefully taken on by NATO while still garnering consensus. So there's a broad set of potential there that I think the alliance should give significant consideration to. The second point I would make is just that I think NATO really needs to focus on adopt and adapt, is the way I will term it. So clearly, NATO, as all militaries, are chasing the commercial sector and will not be driving innovation per se in these technologies. So it's going to put a premium on creating a very different dynamic in terms of how militaries and defense establishments relate to the leading edge of these technologies, which are often small companies, companies that don't regularly deal with governments, with national institutions, international organizations per se. So on the US side, we've garnered a number of lessons, and the United States government has actually moved substantially to try to improve the mechanisms for public-private cooperation to encourage small companies, large companies, and companies in between. We've also proposed additional flexibilities for our Department of Defense to work beyond just the defense realm. Again, the Department of Defense needs to work with foreign academic organizations, with foreign commercial entities, as well as nonprofits. So there's really a very different approach that NATO is going to need to shift. And the other point I would conclude with here is just urgency. We don't have a lot of time to do this. This is a very, very urgent matter. Our colleagues have noted how quickly the Russians have moved beyond just experimentation into the actual operational use of AI technologies, often without the responsible use and ethics that we would be comfortable underlying them. And the Chinese similarly are moving out very quickly on the application realm. So we need to keep that in mind, lest we find ourselves losing competitive advantage at an even faster rate than we already are.
All right, thanks, Matt. I'm going to start working in some of the questions, though I'll certainly be taking moderator's privilege and throwing my own in there. So again, if you have questions from the audience, to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is the best way to send it in. Sir Patrick, we have two up top that I want to put together for you that are directed towards you. They're both related to intelligence, which is something you brought up. The first is from Ben Hodges, who I think is a well-known figure for anybody who works in the European national security sector. He asks, what more needs to be done to improve information and intel sharing between the allies outside of Five Eyes agreements in order to take advantage specifically of the potential of AI and intel fusion? And then we have another question that's somewhat related from Johannes Affefeld, who asks, with a view on the mutual eavesdropping, which was disclosed by Snowden in 2013, do you think we've completely left the wounds behind in order to start with intelligence for AI? So 2 questions about intelligence sharing related to AI from the UK perspective. Sir Patrick, if you would please take a swing at that.
I'll have a go. First of all, it's great to hear, if remotely, from Ben, who was a great mentor and friend and made a huge contribution both as US Army Europe commander and then subsequently as well. Ben, it's great to sort of inverted columns meet you. We'll see you again. I would point to the experience we had on Project Maven, working with the US, which of course was about precisely what I described earlier on, which is pattern recognition, object recognition in imagery, and trying to raise analysts up the value chain and remove the sort of dull and dirty work. And I think it was the head of the Jack Shanahan, when he was head of the JAIC, told Secretary Work that he was unable to achieve the timeline that he had been set in the implementation of Maven because there were too many security concerns about the data. And it turned out to be about the metadata. And if you could extract the metadata, then suddenly data sharing became much easier. And that was between 2 very close partners, the US and the UK, all part of the Five Eyes Alliance. So what that teaches us is that if you're going to get after data sharing, and that's so fundamental to the creating a broader approach to AI, then you've got to start with data security and the right sort of data standards, and being able to demonstrate that the data security that you are going to implement as a partner is going to satisfy the donor nation, as it were, then suddenly you get into a place where you can really expand. So for me, it's about the obvious things like common data standards so that we can curate the data and exploit it properly. That I think will get easier because the AI itself will begin to solve that for us. But it is fundamentally about making sure that you've got sufficient standards of data security, and then suddenly you can broaden the envelope with more and more NATO partners. The second question, I don't think we'll ever get over the Snowden concerns. I think it's going to be with us for a very long time. So I guess the 2 places I'd go to are, first of all, to point to the importance of, first of all, an ethical framework. And we're developing a set of ethical principles ourselves for the use of AI. We're working closely with NATO on doing that, so that you can begin to generate the confidence that's needed. The establishment of a set of international norms, not GDPR, but because that's more regulatory, but something that breeds that confidence. Hence this importance of a values competition and creating a framework of our own values that people trust, but also demystifying what we're talking about. You know, we're not using AI here in the way that your question implies about Snowden. We are using this to do what machines can do better than humans, which is to spot patterns in data and improve the speed of decision making. It's not about facial recognition or spying.
All right, thanks for that answer. We have another one from Ben Hodges, actually, for Dr. Franke. He writes, I appreciate your comments about European views for American enthusiasm for use of AI. Given that, what are the procedures and prospects for the Bundesbank passing law that will enable more effective use of AI in unmanned systems? Sorry, the Bundestag. I think maybe we could also broaden this out for some of the other panelists as well after Dr. Franke answers, to ask about, I think, domestic policies in some of their countries and how those are being developed. But Dr. Franke, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, thanks. I've seen this question. So I am not sure that the biggest problem at the moment when it comes to using AI or indeed unmanned systems is that there are any kind of legal hurdles so much. I think it is more a question of kind of willingness and wanting to do that. So it's a bit tricky. So okay, if you're talking about kind of unmanned system and armed drones and all of that, there's a whole German debate that I don't want to get into right now, and that's, if you like, this is a Bundestag decision, but this isn't really AI related. But on the AI side, I don't think I kind of agree with what seems to be the premise of the question, that there's a legal obstacle, if you like, and that the Bundestag necessarily, so that the parliament needs to kind of create new laws to change this. I think actually when it comes to AI in the military realm, I want to hear more from the MOD and from the Bundeswehr, from the armed forces. I think it's actually up to them to kind of be more clear on what they want, how they want to use AI, where they don't want to use AI. Germany does not have a military AI strategy. France, for instance, does, which I think is extremely useful. So I think that's what we need to see more. And then, of course, at one point, once you talk about acquisition and actually buying certain things and funding certain things, that's where the Bundestag comes in. But I don't think we're even there yet. So yeah, I think I want to hear more from the MOD and the armed forces at this point. So there's more needed in terms of kind of thinking about this, publicly thinking about the saying where we want to go, rather than any specific law needed from the Bundestag.
Dr. Boover, I'm wondering if you agree with that, and maybe if you have a sense of France, for instance, where Paris is on some of these issues.
Yeah, yes, thank you. I think those are important subjects. In France, there is a national strategy on AI. This is something that President Macron put in place. He actually asked Cédric Villani, a Fields Medal in mathematics and AI, to put it together. And the strategy starts from the research angle. Of course, Villani is a researcher, and starts from the data perspective, from the perspective that without data, AI isn't much. I mean, you have the algorithms and the computers, but without data, you don't do anything. So it starts from there. It recognizes that France has a good level of research, R&D, more R&D on AI, but builds on the need to further develop the talent pool. And therefore, there's been a number of actions on having a number of masters and pushing people to study AI, and also a very strong push on innovation, on startups, on helping for the French startups develop, on helping people to relocate to France with the Choose France program, for example, to be able to work on AI and other leading edge areas in France, and development of further venture capital. In-Q-Tel is clearly something that France has watched for a long time as something with envy, and therefore there's a much smaller, more nascent, but there's a defense ministry-led VC arm that has been set in place, the FINOV. So there's a number of initiatives that have been put in place there, and yes, there's some thoughts about the use of AI in the military. But even after I've said that, first of all, we keep the challenge of having a position at European level, but I think more fundamentally, maybe we have this issue of innovation coming from the commercial sector, and the commercial sector is not a place of cooperation. Research is a place of competition and cooperation, and researchers know how to do that very well. And the world of allies, as in NATO, is a world of cooperation. But the world of commercial companies is not a world of cooperation, in particular in AI and startups in the area. So you have this tension between putting more effort to have more startups, having some of them becoming very powerful, and then wanting to work with them to get this to be used for military and defense purposes. And that's a challenge that, of course, NATO is and the Commission, I'm sure, are very familiar with.
So that's really interesting. Kadi, I'd like to turn to you on this one, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that Estonia very early when it was developing cyber capabilities, developed close ties with its domestic industry. And very early on, there was good cooperation there. I'm wondering if there's parallels with what's going on with AI, both internally in Estonia, and then more broadly, in your role as the Secretary for Policy, reaching out to your colleagues across Europe and talking with them. What are the discussions that you're having, the kind of conversations you're having when it comes to making sure national policies are lining up on this stuff?
On cooperation with industry, and our approach with cyber was and is also with AI to foster innovation. What we are against is over-regulation, sort of blanket over-regulation. When we have a national AI strategy, but it does not deal with defense per se. And in defense, we have taken a very flexible approach. We think we need to look at the sorts of solutions we are using. I mean, we shouldn't have the same sort of regulation for an algorithm sifting through data in the back office and an autonomous weapon. So we need to make a clear differentiation there. And when it comes to our dialogue with other countries, I mean, of course, there are different sensitivities. There are some countries, such as Germany, for whom this issue is more sensitive. In Estonia, broadly in society, the issue is not that sensitive. And then even more broadly, when we look at how regulation is managed on the EU level, then the newly proposed AI regulation, EU's AI regulation, does not apply to defense. It says so explicitly, but there's the issue of dual-use technologies, which it sort of does apply to. So the world of AI regulation is dizzying. There is so much going on both nationally as well as in different organizations, and we sort of try to take a very pragmatic approach, not try to over-regulate while we don't even know what the capability or the solution is.
Thanks. Matt, I'd like to go to you to maybe close this one out, because I think, obviously the study, that the committee was focused on not just wholly national security, but all of the different aspects, S&T, R&E, kind of working with the commercial sector. From your standpoint, in the US and having really dove into this for several years now, how is cooperation with the commercial sector on the US side, and how is cooperation with the European politics and the European commercial sector going to work going forward on these issues?
Yeah, I think from the time I came in to the present, commercial public-private cooperation has improved substantially, particularly with the Department of Defense. It's a very large organization. It takes time to move, but it's moving. There are a record number of companies now, big, small, and in between, that are working with Department of Defense, the intelligence community. But it isn't just about defense. To win this competition, as we suggest in our report, there's a much broader spectrum of the elements that are needed to compete geopolitically, to collaborate with a wide range of allies and partners, and to produce outcomes for the publics that our governments are responsible to, that generate prosperity, security, and reinforce freedom. So that's kind of like the top level marker I would suggest. Now, below that level, I think your question touches on some of the frictions that still remain between the United States and Europe, particularly in kind of some of the regulatory spaces. And so, again, I'll reinforce the point. It's urgent that the United States and the European Union launch some type of technology dialogue as part of the broader strategic dialogue, and that the EU piece and the NATO pieces move in parallel, and that there's improved connectivity between what we're doing at NATO and what's happening at the EU, so that things that are happening on the commercial, economic, and political side are as best, to the degree we can best synchronize them with what we need to be doing on the security side at NATO. The other point I would make is, I think the COVID crisis, as all crises, offer opportunity, despite the tremendous human tragedy. And in particular, I'm struck, and I think a number of my colleagues on our commission are struck by the way AI allowed us to accelerate the development of vaccines to basically roughly a year or less in ways that would have been unimaginable prior to the maturation of machine learning technologies in particular. So I think that's a very good example of how the United States, Europe, Canada, as well as a number of our Asian and Indo-Pacific democratic friends can start to focus on concrete collaborations while still working through some of these thorny and difficult regulatory and policy issues that we need to come together on. The last point, again, and I know I keep beating the drum on this one, is just urgency. It's very urgent that we come together, that we develop a kind of a shared sense of purpose, as well as a shared sense of the challenges and the threats. And we need to be clear-eyed. There are clear threats out there to international security or national security. And there's a competing vision that I'll kind of close on. It's, again, the notion that these technologies enhance the responsibilities of governments to their people, or they can be used to ensure that people are responsible to their governments. If that's not a unifying cause for democratic nations around the world, I don't think we can find a better one to rally the cause around, despite all the challenges that we may face. Thanks again to SIPA and to my distinguished colleagues. I really learned so much from speaking with you today.
We do have a little bit more time, Matt. You're not escaping quite yet. That was my apology for jumping the gun on that one a little bit. I do want to ask, though, because you brought up democracy, which is, we've seen with the Biden administration early on, that's a key focus from this president. The idea of democracy needs to be able to survive. It needs to prove that it's better than authoritarianism as an option for the public. We have a question that asks the following. The creation and distribution of content will change rapidly because of AI. Since the foundation of democracy is based on getting correct information through the media, what will be the approach of NATO or democratic countries towards this problem? And I want to build on that because I think it raises the question also back to trust and trust in the public and trust to an extent. How do you build trust about artificial intelligence and education about artificial intelligence in the allied public imagination? And I don't know if anybody has a preference on who wants to maybe tackle this one first, because it's a big, confusing question. But maybe, Kadi, if you want to maybe start, and we can go around the horn from there.
Yes, thanks. I think, to be honest, the issue is less. The problem is less in Estonia, as I said in my last comment. The public is used to sharing their data. Our digital infrastructure, is well known. So the same sort of privacy or other concerns are not really at the level that they are in a lot of other countries. But I want to echo the importance of education. I mean, AI, as many have said, is sort of an enabling technology. So it will essentially affect everyone. And while not everyone needs to become a data scientist, everyone, and also senior leadership, needs to understand the effects of this technology, of course, more broadly, but also in the sphere of defense. And here. One of the ideas that we're pushing for is to have sort of a senior leadership level tabletop exercise to not drag them down into technical details, but just to make black and white what the effects of AI could be. So I think that's something that we need to look at, educating our top leadership.
Sir Patrick, maybe if you want to take this next, because in addition to the question of public disinformation and how AI could affect it, we know certainly in the US, there's been a lot of concerns about the targeting of military members with disinformation, a lot of it driven by artificial intelligence, botnets, such and deep fakes and whatnot. Do you have any thoughts on kind of these broad issues?
So this is a deep fake question, I think. I mean, the first thing to say is AI has already changed how content is managed. I mean, every time you go and use Google or use any server, you're using AI. So we should recognize that this isn't some future reality we're going to have to deal with. We're living with it now. And I look at this perhaps slightly narrowly through the lens of my responsibilities for protecting critical national information in cyberspace. And we have been, on one level, alarmed by the proliferation of disinformation and the threat that it poses to the very fabric and cohesion of societies and the threat to our democratic processes. And we can all point to whether it's the DNC or different practices that the Russians in particular have used, but others have as well. But I've also been quite encouraged at the same time by the sort of limit to the credulousness of the public. People, there is something about trusting people to see through this. You're always going to have a lunatic fringe, forgive me, out there who just enjoy conspiracy theories and buy into it. But it seems to have a half-life, which is manageable, but also our ability, particularly in cyberspace, to counter some of these more organized state-backed campaigns and protect democracy. And you can point to the work that we've and others have done with the US, and for my case, working with GCHQ and the NSA and Cyber Command, US Cyber Command, to protect US democracy. So yes, it's a threat, but it's one that's with us already. And this is where AI really can help, because just as it can pose a threat and it can allow you to create deep fakes, it's also the solution, the key to solving it. And it's another example about positive use of AI to protect the public.
Great. We have just about 2.5 minutes left. I just got the sign. So I want to wrap with a kind of a quick around the horn again question. And if we can keep our answers short, I believe the fine folks at SIPA would appreciate it. Looking towards the June 14th NATO summit, when we expect something to come out focused on artificial intelligence, we know it's going to be a major topic. We expect to see some sort of deliverable. I'm wondering if we could just kind of go through very quickly and just if each of you could maybe say one or two things that you're going to be looking for out of that conference, one or two maybe deliverables or actual points or topics or scheduled items that could come out of this that you think would kind of be a sign that things are moving the ball forward. And Sir Patrick, we'll start with you, and I'll just go down the line from there.
I haven't had enough chance to think about it. I think the two things that I would like to see the most movement on is something about people, because I think it's talent that is really going to get us there, and then something about unlocking the shackles of our sclerotic public administration acquisition processes. Those are the two things that will make my life easiest in the long term.
Great, thank you. Matt, do you want to go next?
Sure. I would, for 2 points that I would highlight, one would be a sense of collective urgency about the threats as well as the opportunities that AI and the AI stack present to NATO and allied nations. And then I think the second thing that I would look for is a commitment to establishing the AI foundations to be AI ready by a particular date. And the United States, I think, would suggest a particularly aggressive date. We've suggested 2025 for our national experience. So perhaps something similar for NATO. I think those two elements would be useful, but we would need to do it in a way that's careful and recognizes the different levels that the Undersecretary spoke about AI readiness across the alliance.
Great. Dr. Franco, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so my wish may not sound super ambitious, but I think it's important. What I like to see is NATO calling upon all NATO members to publish something like a military AI strategy or a comparable paper. The EU Commission actually did this for national AI strategies. So just kind of clarifying what we were talking about earlier. So most European countries actually have national AI strategies. Last time I counted 21 out of the 28 or 27 EU member states, but only France so far has a military AI strategy. And what I want is NATO to kind of make NATO members spell out a bit more clearly how they want to use AI, where they don't want to use AI, what red lines are. Again, that may not sound super ambitious, but it's kind of the first step that is needed to do any of the kind of collaborative things that we discussed today.
All right, Dr. Bouvereau.
Yes, sure. Maybe I'll link this to the trustworthy AI discussion. I think AI needs to be trusted more, and therefore anything that NATO and the summit can do to get the use of AI to be more trustworthy. And I think that's true. Transparency, accountability, training. I think that will ease the acceptability and the level of support, and therefore the ability to reach the goals.
All right, Madam Undersecretary, you get the last word.
Thank you very much. And I'm in a particular situation because it's 1 month to the summit. So what we will get from there, we already pretty much know. I'm not sure whether I'm allowed to say exactly, but broadly the two things. Of course, it's no secret that an AI strategy is coming from the Estonian perspective. What's important for us is that in addition to broader principles on regulation, we also have specific use cases so that we actually get to work as soon as possible. And then the other side is moving forward on dual-use technologies and the sort of civil-military cooperation that we talked about, which is also crucial if we want to stay ahead in the technology race. Thank you.
Well, my journalist bones are all shaking that I should ask you some more questions on this, but unfortunately we are out of time. Everyone, I really appreciate the time. SIPA appreciates all of your thoughts with us today. We thank the audience for joining us today. And with that, we are concluding this panel. Going to hand it off to Lauren Speranza to close the event. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And let me just very briefly add my thanks to everyone. Thanks to you, Aaron, for leading such a great discussion. And to all of our fantastic panelists. I think it's just really so important to have both the NATO institutional perspective as well as all of these national perspectives in one place so that we can leverage all the great things and thinking and work that are already ongoing across allies, rather than reinvent the wheel at the transatlantic level to try and take advantage of what's already underway. And that's something that's really important to us at SIPA, and also why earlier this year we launched a whole new initiative around defense technology as part of our transatlantic security work. We brought on a new bunch of fellows that bridge the tech and industry communities along with the military and policy communities to try and bring everyone to the same table. And the work is really about helping the United States and our allies explore how to harness and leverage these technologies for our own defense. So we're focused on everything from artificial intelligence, edge computing, autonomous systems, space capabilities, cognitive capabilities, and how all of these things can support defense planning, warning systems, decision-making, all things that came up today for both hybrid and conventional threats. And importantly, how all these technologies can be made more standardized, interoperable, and resilient for the future. So in our view, there's a lot of debate around emerging tech and national security, but perhaps not enough on tech and transatlantic security. So we're really glad that we had the opportunity to have this discussion today through the transatlantic lens, because that we believe is the key challenge. And doing this together through NATO is the West's greatest strategic advantage in an increasingly contested world. So thank you all to everyone for being part of this discussion. I'd encourage everyone to stay tuned for more. Thank you all for being here, and to our audience for the questions, and to NSCAI, and importantly, my team at SIPA for all of the hard work. But we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thank you.